What is going on, everyone? Tim from Tier Fawn Orbital. It's me again. Hope you all are having a great day. Anyhow, we're going to talk about an install that I completed on a staff lightsaber. This is for the Seeker that was released by Korbanth and Shadowfoil Props, God, almost 2 years ago now. This happens to be my favorite staff. I'm not a huge staff fan. Like I'm just, don't judge me. I don't like Maul's hilt. I don't like many of the Inquisitor's hilts. However, this thing, when I saw this in the Ahsoka series, this thing is absolutely rad. It is super gnarly looking. I love the color scheme on this. Shadowfoil did a great job at staying very, very true and dedicated to the props that were used in the show. And it just looks awesome. I actually have one in my collection. I really, really like the look of this hilt. However, full disclosure, I don't like this hilt for install. I just don't. It's from an installer and a designer standpoint, there's just so much going on the inside of this hilt that you have to take into account, right? There are screws that are holding these blades in place. There are screws that are holding some of the emitters in place. There's just like a lot going on the inside of this, and I did not like designing the chassis for this hilt, right? I do want to go over in detail how to use this. However, there is a very specific way to put this chassis in the hilt. There are some things that you have to keep in mind of when you're putting the chassis in. So we are going to talk about all of that. I switched up the chassis design on this one as well. So previous installs on this, I just did a regular short removable chassis. And the switch section had an upper PCB holder that stayed inside of the hilt. I felt as though that was a little bit less user friendly. We also had PCBs, rotary PCBs to take into account. And that is, a point of failure sometimes. So I did a fully removable, tall chassis for this install, just to keep everything in one. It's a little bit easier to put the whole chassis in. However, like I said, there's just a few things to keep in mind when putting this chassis in the hilt. Okay, so we are going to come into Fusion and talk about this chassis, and then we will come up top, do a quick demo, and be on our way. Very, very cool feature with Proffi V3 now. The new version of Proffi V3 is independent control of two separate blades. And we will also talk about that when we do a demo, right? But before we do that, let's come into Fusion and talk about this chassis. All right, so here it is, the Long Boy chassis. So this is done in two pieces. It's very, very tall. My very humble Carbon X1. The build volume on that is not tall enough for this chassis, right? So it is in two parts. These are epoxied together once everything is wired up. But let's start at the bottom, right? So right off the bat, no speaker at the bottom. Another thing with staff hilts and staff installs is speaker venting, right? Because you've got two blades on each end, you can't have a speaker vent out the bottom or the top, right? With this particular design, one of the cool things is this vent section in the middle of the hilt, right? And that will allow for speaker venting through the middle of the hilt. And that is why this giant gaping hole is here, right? This is a 22 millimeter speaker from the Saber Merchant, right? And that is what is in the middle of this hilt. Very out of the box chassis design, as you often see with staff installs, okay? So at the bottom, because we've got a blade at one end, or at each end, this is where I've got a blade side, or a hilt side rather, lit blade PCB, okay? There is a trench that goes underneath the battery for all of my wires, right? So I've got 3 conductors for my blade PCB. I've got 1 for my negative battery tab. And then up top, we've got our positive battery tab. A lot going on down here. I also made it a little bit more difficult for myself, wire management-wise, by adding 8 rectangular red LEDs on the side of this hilt, right? Just to give us a little bit of extra accent. Now, another thing that you'll probably notice is that this is not a simple circular chassis, and that is because of all of the stuff that is on the inside of this hilt. There's a lot of screws protruding onto the inside. Because these blades are so heavy, there is a very robust screw holding each end in place, and it's large. It's very large. So you've got to account for that. You've got to account for some other screws. It's just like, it's a pain. It was a pain. It's a pain doing the chassis for this. So anyhow, up top, we've got one Proffieboard. Okay. Now I've seen this installed with two Proffieboards before, but with the new updated prop file from Brian Connor, the Proffieboard coding wizard, you can now control two separate blades with one Proffieboard, and that is how I set this up. Okay, so our Proffieboard lives here. There is a kill switch on the side, some light greebly work on each side of the board, and then up top here is our stem that connects, or that continues, that upper blade PCB to the top part of the emitter. All right. Switches. Switches are another thing that you've got to take into account, right? Some of these plunger switches do protrude into the inside of the hilt as well. You've got to account for that. We've got 3 plunger switches on one side, and then at the back, we've got a yellow trigger switch, which is another really, really cool design aspect of this hilt, and I wanted to make that functional, right? So we've got a very small brass hat tactile switch here. It's not a brass hat tactile, rather. It's just a regular black tactile switch. So once everything is wired up, these two pieces get epoxied together, and it is one singular long chassis. All right. So let's talk about it, right? Let's come up top. All right, so here it is. This is the Seeker from Korbanth and Shadowfoil props. Here is that long, long chassis. Now this hilt, it's just such a gnarly, gnarly looking hilt, right? I happen to love this. It's almost like a blue gunmetal color on the outside of this. It's just such a great, great looking hilt. Very, very well machined and manufactured hilt as well. However, there's just a lot of parts. There's just a lot going on, okay? And there's a lot to do to get this chassis into the hilt, right? There's a lot of things that you need to go through, and we're going to talk about that right now, actually. So, to get your chassis in the hilt, you're going to put it in one end. Okay, so I've set this up to have the chassis go in the end that is opposite these switches, all right? So as I'm touching this, there's a lot of loose parts, all right? Like, full disclosure, this one blade will flip up, all right? And I'm not going to do that for the demo, but it is loose. And I'm not sure if that is a design aspect of this hilt or not. The one that I have in my collection does the same thing, but just something to be aware of, right? These shrouds are loose because I have unthreaded these 2 screws. Now you need to back these 2 screws out before you put the chassis in, right? So there are 2 screws that hold this emitter in place, and those need to be backed out, okay? So let's talk about the chassis really quickly first as well, right? So here is the chassis. This will take a button top protected 18650 battery. Go ahead and put your battery in place, all right? There are those lit rectangular LEDs along the side, okay? Once you get your battery in, let's go ahead and put the chassis in place, right? So I've backed out these 2 screws that hold that shroud in place. Now, you're not going to be able to really see this on camera, but there's a lot going on down the middle of this hilt, okay? I like to line up these 3 switches with the 3 switches on the outside of the hilt, and you want to just kind of very delicately slide this chassis in place. Let me see if I can stay on camera here. There, that rear black tactile switch protrudes out a lot. It's really, really tall, and that is in order to make a connection with this yellow trigger, all right? That giant screw that is holding these blades in place, just be mindful of that. So you want to slide that kind of just past that screw. And if you take a look at the bottom or through the hilt, you can really easily see where it's at. You just slide that past that screw until it's past, and then you want to keep sliding your chassis all of the way down until it stops. Okay, because there is a collar that is in this emitter. There's one in each emitter actually, but you want to slide that in until it stops. All right. Okay. Now, once that chassis stops, you want to get the other collar, and this is what's going to hold the entire assembly in place. All right. Once your chassis is past these two screws as well, you can go ahead and tighten them. Okay. Once those are tightened, it will help this collar to slide in place. There are also two set screws that are in each emitter. All right. There is a hole in the collar. Line up that hole with those set screws. Okay. Now, this bottom set screw is what secures that collar in place. And the top set screw will serve as your blade retention. All right. Now your chassis is in place. I know I breezed through that. It's a very, very intricate hilt to use. Like, I'm full disclosure, it's just, there's just so much going on the inside of this hilt. You've got to make sure everything is lined up correctly. But to you, the customer, once you get a feel for putting the chassis in, it'll get easier. Just be aware, as I mentioned, that there's just so many screws on the inside of this, and you don't want those screws getting caught up on the chassis or that switch, that trigger switch. Okay, so everything is in. Let's go ahead and come down to the bottom and put a couple of blades in this. As I desperately try to not whack my ceiling fan, because we've got two blades going in a staff. All right, see how I'm going to do this. So we've backed out these set screws for our blade retention, right? Okay. We'll go ahead and put our blades in. This will take a 1-inch blade on each end. So I'm going to rest my blade on those PCB pins. I'll tighten this one. Okay. And I'm going to put another blade in. Okay. And then we are ready to go. So, let's see if we can get this on camera here. The two independent blades. I'm probably going to have to back up, right? So here we go. So 1, 2, oops, 2. All right, I'm not going to swing this around too much, but let's talk about the switches, right? So there are 3 switches here. The top switch will control your top blade. The bottom switch will control your bottom blade. Now, if you want to activate both blades at the same time, you can hit the trigger. Okay. And the trigger will also serve as your aux. All right. Okay. Let's go ahead and to retract your blades, it's a long press of the button. Let's scroll through a couple fonts here. Whoops. To scroll through your fonts, it is a long press of that middle aux button. Wow, this is so awkward to hold the whole thing on camera. All right, let's go through another one.
Going somewhere.
There goes a fan. Okay. Great sounding hilt with that 22mm speaker in there. You know, we've got a lot of sound venting in the middle of the hilt. Let's do one more. Okay. Yeah, I really can't swing this thing around. It's just way too big. But a very, very cool looking hilt nonetheless, right? So that is the Seeker from Shadowfoil and Korbanth lightsabers. Awesome, awesome looking hilt. Super gnarly, right? So to you, the customer, thank you very much for your support. If anyone has any questions about this particular install or the hilt or anything really, please do not be a stranger. And with that being said, May the force be with you always. Have a good one, everybody.